The hero of our time, my dear sirs, is indeed a portrait, but not of one single person. It is a portrait built up from the vices of our whole generation, in all the fullness of their development. Again, you'll tell me no man can be as bad as that, and I'll ask you why. If you have believed in the possibility of the existence of all the villains of tragedy and romance, you should not believe in the reality of Pechorin. If you have admired inventions far more terrible and monstrous, why does this character, even as an invention, not deserve your mercy? Could it be because there is more truth in him than you would like? Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. Thanks for joining me today on the roof at the bottom of Seoul. This seems to be an appropriate place to be talking about Pechorin, the wild, puck-like protagonist of Mikhail Lermontov's novel, his 1840 novel, A Hero of Our Time. This novel is cited as the first great Russian novel and a big influence on the great Russian writers, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Turgenev. I'm quite interested in this novel as an influence on Knut Hamsun. You can see the character of Pechorin. He's kind of the prototype of the unnamed narrator in Hunger, the Thomas Glan, the soldier in Pan, and even Nagel from Mysteries. So this novel, I don't know if it was a direct influence on Knut Hamsun. It could have been through Dostoevsky, but clearly there's a lineage here from Pechorin to Knut Hamsun and many of the writers, obviously, that Knut Hamsun has gone on to influence. As I said, Pechorin is a puck-like character, so he behaves badly. He knows he's behaving badly, and that makes him very entertaining. I think the real power from this novel is in its prose. The story itself has some weaknesses, which I'll talk about at the end, but the prose are full of energy, full of life. And that, to me, is the real attraction of this novel. Now, the part I read at the beginning, this is the preface where Lermontov was actually speaking to critics because they were upset with this novel. They could not believe that this was a real character. They thought maybe this was more autobiographical, Lermontov just acting badly. And Lermontov is saying, no, you believed in worse characters, real villains, and this is true. Pechorin is not a super villain. He just acts badly. And maybe the reason why you don't want to believe in this is because he's a bit like us. You see yourself in him. And this is a composite of the times. And by drawing that composite out, narrating it, putting it into a story, I think it gives a little bit of redemption, or the possibility of redemption. And on that note, I would like to just mention that you can support this channel and you can discover new literature by getting a copy of the novel Commuting. You can link to it in the description. You can also link to the Gymnasia Press website, where you can get the short story collection Comorbidities and the novel Non-Local. Thank you. Now, the structure of this novel is complex. It's made up of 5 different stories. The first 2 stories are narrated by an unnamed soldier who, on his journeys, runs into this guy another soldier named Maxim Maximich, who tells him the story of Pechorin. That makes up the first story. The second story is focused on Maxim Maximich, and really it explains how our unnamed narrator gets Pechorin's diary. And in the diary is what makes up story 3, 4, and 5. So we've got a kind of a cobbled together narrative of different stories, but it works well, even though some of the stories I don't think do much for it. They could have been left out. That complexity also has some other, I would say, even postmodern complexities, in the sense that there's comment on the narration and writing. So on page 40, Our narrator, not Pechorin, the original narrator, says, "I'll spare you any descriptions of the mountains, cries of admiration that convey nothing, pictures that depict nothing, particularly for those who have never been there, or statistical observations which no one in the world would think of reading." Now, he's already actually given us some of that in the previous story, but now here he is kind of criticizing it and criticizing kind of the mountain narrative, the travel journal, which this story is partly that. All of these stories take place in the Caucasus, so in some ways they're colonial stories in the sense of Russians going out and kind of fighting with other tribal groups in the area, which actually makes up part of the story Bella, the original story, the first story in here. Now, another part that is in the preface or the foreword to Pechorin's journal. This is kind of the last word from our original narrator before Pechorin takes over. I should mention these two narrators sound a lot alike. That could be a weakness of the writing, or it could be just that they have an affinity for each other. There's a deeper connection than they even knew. By the beginning, though, Pechorin's already dead, and this is the explanation for why these journals are going to get stories from the journal are going to get published. And our narrator says, "Now I must say something of the reasons that led me to reveal to the public the secrets of a man I never knew. It would have been well if I had been his friend, for everyone would have understood the treacherous indiscretion of a true friend. But I had only ever seen him once on the high road, so I am not able to bear him that inexplicable hatred that hides under the appearance of friendship, and only waits for the beloved object to die or suffer some misfortune before letting loose a hail of reproof, advice, mockery, and regrets on his head." So again, you can see that energy of the prose. Again, it's the same that Pechorin has. And they also have a similar view of friendship. They view friends as being treacherous and waiting to do the other friend in. And this is why I think this narrator and Pechorin sound a lot alike, because just a few pages later, there's a similar perspective from Pechorin himself. He says, "We soon understood one another and became companions, for I am incapable of real friendship. Out of any two friends, one is always the other's slave, though often neither of them will admit the fact. I'm not prepared to be a slave, and it's tiring work ordering someone else around because you have to deceive him at the same time. Besides, I have servants and money." So you can see Pechorin, again, he's got a very kind of cynical outlook. There's no real friends in life. We're all trying to get ahead of the other person. And this is very much what we get from Pechorin throughout this novel. This is his view, and this is why, I think early readers were kind of horrified by this so-called hero. Now, that quote comes from the middle story, which is Princess Mary. And this is really the central story of the whole novel. And I actually think the story before it and the story after could have been left out, and maybe this could have been expanded. But this story is really about how Pechorin seduces his friend's love interest, but he's not really interested in her, and he just does it to basically ruin their happiness. And this leads to a duel in which the friend, or now ex-friend, ends up dying. And again, you can imagine how early readers saw this. Developing his character, this is what Pechorin says about himself. "I was lying." He's lying to the girl here. He was lying to his friend here. "I was lying, but I felt like infuriating him. I have an innate passion for contradiction. My whole life has been nothing but a succession of sad and unsuccessful attempts to go against my heart or my reason." again, a character who almost pathologically has to disagree and go against the grain. If I'm with an enthusiast, I'm filled with icy coldness, and I suppose that if I were often exposed to a languid phlegmatic, I'd become a passionate idealist. And I must admit, too, that an unpleasant but familiar emotion touched my heart in that moment, a feeling of envy. I squarely name it envy because I'm used to being honest with myself. And I doubt if there exists a young man, one, that is, who has lived in society and is used to indulging his self-esteem, who would not suffer a pang of envy if he met a pretty girl who aroused his idle fancy and suddenly found her favor in someone else, who she knew no better than himself. So this is kind of the initial reason why Pechorin wants to kind of sabotage his friend's budding romance and interest in this kind of lowly princess, this Princess Mary. Developing more his kind of, I'll call it his moral philosophy, another, I think, passage worth reading. This is coming later, near the end of the novel. He says, I am no longer capable of losing my head in passionate love. My ambition has been crushed by circumstances, but it has reappeared in a different form, for ambition is nothing but a thirst for power. And for me, the supreme pleasure lies in subjecting everything around me to my will. So that's very Nietzschean-like, I believe. To awaken a feeling of love, devotion, and fear, isn't that the first sign of power and his greatest triumph? To be a source of suffering and joy in another person without the slightest genuine right to it, isn't that the sweetest food for our pride? And what is happiness? Pride that is sated. So this character is kind of open with himself that he's indulges his power drive, that this, he wants to have control over other people. He wants to make them feel off guard, make them feel uncomfortable. That reflects his power. And that's exactly what he does in this story, which again eventually leads to tragedy. So ultimately, we do have a tragedy here for a character who is supposed to represent the times and is morally corrupt. As I said at the beginning of this video, the power of this novel, I think, is really in the prose. So just briefly, some of the weaknesses. The story that comes after this, I think, is really anticlimactic. It could have been left out. Same thing with the one before that, called Tamen. Another thing that I've noticed here is there's this reoccurring plot device where Pechorin overhears people talking. Now, this might be true to the times where people had, I think, more public life, and you might have more discussions outside at the cafe, and you could overhear people talking. But as a device for gaining new insight or secret insight, I think it happens a bit too much in this novel. And I would imagine, this is the only novel Lermontov wrote, so perhaps maybe if he had a longer career, he died quite young, maybe that would have been different. I believe he actually died of a duel as well, which is obviously in this kind of makes up the tragedy of the main story in this novel, and just like Lermontov's hero Pushkin, who also died of a duel. So I guess that was one of the hazards of living in the 1800s. All right, that's going to do it for today. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.